Hello, everyone. This lecture should be watched on May 28th. This is Dan again, coming to you live. Well, live for me, not live for you, from my office at Radford University. Uh, Today, we are going to have two little mini lectures, one about field and quasi experiments, and the other about designing measures. Um, so here we're going to learn the ins and outs of field studies, quasi-experimental designs, and then experimental problems, which apparently I can't even spell correctly. That's fine. We're just going to leave that in there. The mistakes are birds, my friends. So let's talk a little bit about field studies, or what we might call field experiments. These are studies that use any type of design, correlational or experimental, uh, in a natural setting, in the settings which they happen to occur. Take, for example, a study done at University of Columbia, where students approached strangers in Greenwich Village, in New York City, attempted to see if the type of request that they gave could influence compliance with the request. So this study happened in the late 1960s is when they collected the data, and it was published in 1970. Um, so here, students in their classes were asked to be as unselective as possible in who they asked for help. But they recognized that there was probably a tendency to avoid the most seedy or threatening prospective compliers. And here's what they found. I'm sorry about the color there. That's not really accessible. I'll make sure to get that changed. They approached strangers and asked them, "Excuse me, I wonder if you could either tell me what time it is, tell me how to get to Times Square, give me change for a quarter." I remember it's 1970s. Tell me what your name is. Ooh, that one's kind of weird. Or give me a dime. What they mean by dime is a 10-cent piece. That's what they're asking for there, which in 1970 would have been like, a couple dollars. You can see here the number of people they asked and the percent of people who helped. The lowercase letters here in the subscripts represent clusters. So these groups were not significantly different from each other. These groups were lower than these three, and they were not significantly different from each other. So there's some good and bad to this study. The positive is that there's high generalizability. Measuring people in the real world, conditions are set up also so that there's an increasing material or time cost to participants. Some questions that I had were, is the name question realistic? Like, I can't imagine somebody coming up to me in the middle of the city and asking me what my name is. Like, get lost. I don't have to tell you anything. Um, Yesterday at my kids' soccer practice, they let the parents practice and scrimmage with the kids, and a lot of the other dads were talking about their ages, and they were saying that they were like 31 and 32. And then they turned to me and asked me, "Dan, how old are you?" And I responded to that, "No, I'm not telling you. Uh, I am considerably older than you all." Um, just too much personal information going around. I want to go back to when we don't know anything about each other. What construct are the conditions representing? So they are increasing in material or time cost, but I'm not really sure what exactly that's representing. Is it material, time? Um, how are they doing that there? And there might be selection bias. I would be less likely to ask somebody their name if they look like they might harm me, or something like that. Whereas I might be more willing to ask them for, change for a quarter. So when you're constructing field experiments, this is really important for you all. because this is probably what you're going to end up doing is focusing on the location. Researchers select field sites based on uh, trying to find samples that belong to the group that they're trying to study. So people of a particular age, occupation, religious affiliation, so on and so forth. Um, and the goal of field experiments is always higher generalizability. They don't necessarily have to be low on internal validity, though, but higher generalizability, which we'll talk about in a lecture next week. Um, and Another key aspect is to attempt to make the measurement unobtrusive, or in other words, the participants don't know that they're actually being studied. So you can use naturally occurring variables in field experiments that represent the independent variable. So in the past, some folks have picked the grocery store that people are shopping at to represent social class. I lived in Tennessee for a little bit, so I don't think of Food City as the higher end store, but here in Radford, that's the higher end store. They've even got a bar inside where you can sit down and have a drink before you shop. Whereas maybe Walmart or Food Lion would be lower class. So here you're picking your location based on your independent variable. Um, Another example might be researchers who are interested in bystander helping, um, might be like on a bus or in a train, and they code for who needs help. Is it an older adult, mother with children, lost tourist, and so on and so forth. Researchers can also make their independent variables uh, manipulated. They can turn their studies into experiments. I think it's a common misconception that in field studies, you tend to just do correlational research. That's not true. You can do experimental manipulations. So maybe here, bystander, a study of bystander helping might manipulate the characteristics of a Confederate. Is the person lower or higher social status or social class? And maybe they ask for something like, change for $1, something like that. You could even do something like a modeling study where you have half of the folks in the half of the Confederates returning a cart, say like a shopping cart at the grocery store, right in front of the participant who has a shopping cart, whereas the other half leaves their shopping cart in the parking space. This is right in front of the participant. So maybe you're modeling some kind of behavior in front of them, and that has an effect on the participants' willingness to return their card or not. There are some issues with field experiments. One is threats to internal validity called selection bias. This is where participants or researchers uh, or some like just simple geography can have it so people are differentially selected into conditions. So for example, think back to the Columbia study. Uh, we might have been less likely to have people who looked more intimidating in questions that were higher risk. Um, and sometimes it's really hard to randomly assign participants to an experimental study. One example of selection bias that I'm always really happy to share about was a study when I was a grad student at VCU. I never even knew who was running the study. I would just see flyers for it all the time. It was called the CO2 breathing study. And the way that it was billed was people got to do this challenge where they saw how much they would breathe in carbon dioxide. And I thought to myself, who in the world would participate in this study? And then I reflected a little bit more and I said, well, 18-year-old college me probably would have participated in this study, and I probably would have gotten my buddies in to see if we could compete against each other. Or in other words, the people who you're selecting into this study are not representative of the population. Okay. You can also ask self-report questions in a field study, but don't do that. Remember, the major advantage of field studies is that you can measure people unobtrusively. Um, if they're unaware of being in the study, then that reduces the threat to internal validity, reduces threats of demand characteristics, social desirability, and so on. So switching gears, I want to talk a little bit about scale development. Um, and again, you probably won't use this, but if you do in your field studies, this would be something to pay attention to. Um, so we're going to talk about some explicit measures and problems with them, and implicit measures and problems with those. Um, but some basic problems that you should think of when you're making a measure or a scale that people self-report on are that for the most part, people do have the ability to introspect. They have the ability to think about their own thinking. But we're not that great at it for a couple of reasons. I'm sorry, everybody, the font changed colors on me here. I'm gonna just fix this real quick while we're working and talking. Don't mind me. The mistakes are birds. So what are some common things that affect people's ability to introspect? In a study done in 1983 by Norb Schwartz and Jerry Clore, they called up faculty members at other institutions around the country. And they had them fill out a survey about their quality of life over the phone. It's 1983, so the internet had not been invented by the NSF just yet. That's a fact. The NSF invented the internet. Well, they didn't invent it. They perfected it. Internet with a capital I. So they called these folks up and they gave them a quality of life measure, and they recorded whether or not it was raining there that day. So they actually looked at the forecasts, and they found that when it was raining, people rated their quality of life as lower. Now, um, rain does not actually have an effect on quality of life. People were probably just in a bad mood, and they misattributed that bad mood to their quality of life because they were reporting about it. So to test this idea, Schwartz and Clore, for half of the participants, asked them right before they filled out the measure, hey, how's the weather out there that day? And asking them this completely wiped out the association between the weather and people's quality of life. Or in other words, if you drew their attention to it, if they weren't able to misattribute uh, the rain to their quality of life, uh, they wouldn't do it. The rain would have no effect. Okay, so here, if we are not aware of the causes of our behaviors, then it can have an effect on our self-report. Motivation can also have some effects on our self-reporting. In a study done by Jeff Green and Konstantin Setakidis, that's a Greek name there. It sounds like you have a set or a group of kitties, cats. They did a study in which they gave people false feedback about their performance. And what they found that people misremembered false feedback that was negative about themselves and central to their identity. So like if I was told that I was not a good dad, I would misremember that because being a dad is very central to my identity. And that would be negative feedback. That's not something that I want to hear. Whereas feedback that was negative but peripheral to your identity. Like for me, whether or not I'm a good athlete, I don't care about that. And that would have, I would not misremember that. Okay. So people are motivated to avoid information that is negative about themselves and central to their identity. Another thing that gets in the way of introspection is retrospective bias. Sometimes we really think that we are introspecting, but we're not. If I asked you to select a hat out of this lineup that you would be comfortable wearing, that you would like, many of you, probably not all of you, but many of you, most of you, would select the leftmost or maybe the rightmost hat. Um, this is called the serial position bias. And even though you would probably say a whole lot about why you selected that hat and rationalize it, the real reason is because it appears the leftmost. It's based on the position. So, something to be aware of when you're creating measures is that the way that you create them can actually bias people's answers. Take, for example, this. When people were asked to consider the most important thing for children to prepare them for life, 61.5% said to think for themselves when this option was offered on a list. Okay, so imagine this in front of them. What's most important? And then you're presented with a list. When this question was open-ended, however, only 4.6%, that's an enormous difference, said to think for themselves. So presenting people with a list can bias responses so that they appear more frequently. How about this one? When asked how successful people are in life, 34% reported high success when the numeric values ranged from -5 to 5. But this number was a third of that when the numbers ranged from 0 to 10. Okay, so you can see what's going on here. The numbers are different. People are less likely to respond to negative values than they are to positive values. Okay, so there's biased responses in that way. Okay. Here's another one. When asked how often they experience physical symptoms, 62% of the sample reported psychosomatic symptoms more than twice a month, when the response scale ranged from twice a month or less to several times a day. So this is probably around the middle of the scale. But when this became the top item, only 39%, or the top anchor, only 39% rated this as more than twice a month, ranging from never to more than twice a month. So here, more than twice a month is the middle of the scale, and here it's the top end of the scale. So moral of the story here is that more people end up responding right around the middle of the scale, as they should. But it's the same item. It's the same statement, so we shouldn't see any differences there. When you deliver a measure relative to other measures can have effects on correlations between the measures. Okay? So sometimes your marital quality has an effect on your general life satisfaction, but only when you measure it first. If you measure marital quality first, life satisfaction, its association with marital quality is really high, whereas if you measure life satisfaction first, the correlation is low. Okay. So what different types of scales can you use? You can use forced choice versus free choice. Forced choice requires you to answer a question based on different responses that are available to you, like a scale from 1 to 5. Um, whereas free choice allows you to answer questions open-ended. You state what the answers are. I use free choice a lot for things like gender and age, race, ethnicity. Although I've had people tell me that their gender is 21, which is their age. So you have to be careful with that. Um, or I've had people tell me that their gender is white Hispanic or white Latino. Um, not really getting at the question there, although that's a good answer to the race ethnicity question. You can use frequency ratings or scales. You can see an example here on the top is a scale that ranges from totally satisfied to totally dissatisfied. Whereas the one on the bottom is a frequency, how often this occurs. Okay, so these questions can give very different types of answers, and it changes the meaning of your scales. And reference periods are important to use. Here you can see this scale is asking you to report on how you feel at the moment. Um, and you're ranging from one emotion to the other here. Again, the numbers assigned to the scales can have very different effects. As we saw earlier, um, these numbers that we assign can psychologically change their meaning to participants. These up here, the words, we call those anchors. They are there to anchor the participant who is responding to your survey psychologically on what they should interpret that as. So here's some heuristics for developing your measure. Use direct language to ask what you want to know. Short, simple sentences with a single clause, no complex sentences. Randomize the order of your questions so that one doesn't influence the other. Include open-ended questions every once in a while to complement your rating skills. I use these to help me see if the rating scales are actually measuring what I want them to. Um, Wait till the end to ask the sensitive questions and include concise directions and explaining what participants should expect. Always, always, always pilot test your questions. So these are just some things to think about. What's wrong with this item? I feel compassion and stress when people are in need. Uh-oh. This is called double barreling. Double barreling. It means that there's two ideas in the question. What if I feel a lot of compassion but no stress? Or what if I feel a lot of stress but no compassion? How do I answer that question? It'd be really hard. So let's take a look at the examples of this and the using a real measure um, called the interpersonal reactivity index. I'm just going to download this here for us to see. And if you want some examples of double barreling, this questionnaire has a lot of them. I daydream and fantasize. Two things. I often have tender and concerned feelings. That's two things. Um, hmm. They feel apprehensive and ill at ease. Okay, so multiple constructs here. Not a good idea to have multiple constructs in the same measure. That's called double barreling. Double barreling. Okay, so let's go back to our PowerPoint here. and talk about a few different types of measures that you can use. Um, all right. Sorry, I'm having trouble sharing this. Okay, here it is. So one type of scale that you can use is called a scaleogram. Here, people respond yes or no to a question. You can see these items are probably measuring something about universal health care. And the number of yeses is coded as one, and the number of nos is coded as zero. And basically, it's just summed up. Um, I thought I had edited this, but I hadn't. We also have Likert scales. Likert scales look at your level of agreement with a statement, and they assign a number based on that level of agreement, which is then averaged after the study. And then semantic differentials. Participants here see an item with two poles. One is got bad and one's got good here. Um, and here they're still rating about public health care. Um, and this rating, participants would respond by putting a mark on how close they are toward one side or the other. And then the researchers would code this with a number. The number is not presented there for them, though. Sometimes we get careless responders in our research. Here you can see there's a really funny answer if you're a fan of Ghostbusters uh, and an open-ended question. But we'll get really odd answers to surveys. We get this sometimes when we use crowdsourcing survey websites where people will actually create bots to answer the questions for them so they can make all the money and not have to do any work. Fun, fun, fun. Um, so here would be an example of a way to get into whether or not the participants are actually paying attention. So this one says, I read every question in a survey, and to show that I'm reading, I'm going to skip this question and go to the next. If the participant had put an answer here instead of skipping this question, we would know that they were not carefully reading. They were responding carelessly. So adding directed questions like this could help to identify careless responders in your studies. Another problem that comes up with self-report measures, again, is that people don't necessarily have to be honest on them. And this is especially important when we're studying things like prejudice, or like in my research, I study empathy, that people are going to misreport how prejudiced or, empathetic they are in everyday life. So implicit measures have been designed to better get at people's biases that they hold. Like, for example, here in this study, you're supposed to categorize words. The word here is salary with its appropriate group. Um, and the correct answer is to move it to the left with the letter E over to career. That's where salary goes. But the idea here is that if you held a bias about females in the workplace, it might actually slow down your reaction time in moving salary over to the left. Okay. There's a lot of different ways that we can use this implicit association test. We can use it with people's faces, where their race is apparent. Um, and we find that sometimes if people hold a bias, it slows down their reaction time when trying to match words to different categories. And they say the implicit association task works based on associations in memory. Think of your memory as a big association web. with nodes on it. So, you might associate, uh, things like, um, going to class with being on time and being prepared. That might be associated in your memory. Um, or you might, associate, uh, your sweetie at home with really positive, emotions. Um, and they say that shorter reaction times when associating things together make for stronger associations. So, um, if it took you a long time to code that, salary belongs with career and female, that might mean that that association is weaker in your association web, or in other words, you hold a bias about females in the workplace. There are problems with this task, though. You can actually fake it and break it if you know what the task is measuring. So you can intentionally wait longer to respond for different results to for different stimuli to skew the results. And is this really an attitude? Are people's associations and memory really an attitude? I don't know. It's been a hotly debated topic, though. Some people say, well, yeah, of course they're an attitude. And others say, well, no, no, they're not. They're just, measuring associations and memory. So to get at that problem, folks created the affect misattribution procedure. Here in this procedure, participants focus on a fixation cross, and then for a very brief blip of time, they're presented with some kind of pleasant or unpleasant stimulus. And then they're presented after a mask, a pictograph, again, very quickly, 100 milliseconds. All right. And the idea is that the people who have are participating in this study are not familiar with what this pictograph means. Or in other words, people have no connotation for it. And over time, presenting this pictograph next to images that are unpleasant will entrain that this is associated with unpleasantness. So later on in the study, participants are shown each pictograph and asked to rate it from very high to very positive. And they say, now this is an attitude. Now, how does this work? You have no original associations in your memory with this pictograph. They're created by pairing it up with unpleasant and pleasant stimuli. So they're using affect misattribution or misattribution of your emotions, where you incorrectly blame the Chinese pictograph as causing this emotional event for you, but really it was the unpleasant image. And they've just been presented so closely in time, so close together in time, that you're misattributing the pictograph as the the cause of your emotions, or in other words, you're rating it as, more negative or more positive based on what it was associated with. So you can see what we might be able to use these measures for. You can measure racial bias, things like that. Uh, it's been used to differentiate people who have addictions. I've got a friend out in New Mexico who does research on pornography addiction, and he's been able to do some really neat stuff with this affect misattribution paradigm. He's a clinical psychologist, and so he provides therapeutic approaches to addiction, and can see that on this task, the therapy is effective at reducing these addictions. So really neat work if you're thinking about using measures in your field study. Go ahead and complete the quiz. This is quiz number 5 by tonight on May 28th. Thanks, everybody.